Now I'm going to show you how to prepare your plate for a monoprint. So to prepare your plate is what we're going to be using to create our artwork onto that we will then print onto a piece of paper. So there are various materials that you can use to create your plate on. You just really need a flat surface that will hold up when it gets wet. So some materials that you can use that you can get at the art store are Yupo paper. This is translucent paper that has a plasticky feel. You could also use Duralar. Duralar are sheets of very thin, clear plastic. You could also use materials that you find around your house. Things like cookie sheets work really well because they're flat and can be wiped down. You could also use a piece of glass or a piece of plastic that is flat. Things like mirrors or even tiles would work really well as well. Of course, you need to check with whoever you live with that would be okay with them and that you will clean them afterwards and make sure that they are as good as new. So today I'm going to be using this cookie sheet for my monoprint. So a monoprint means that you print it once. So you will create your entire image that will be printed onto this plate. I am going to be using these papers to print my monoprint on, so I want to have a sense of the size when I'm creating my plate. So I'm noticing that I don't want it to go all the way, my art to go all the way to the edge, because otherwise because if I do that, then I'm not going to be able to see it on my piece of paper. I want to make sure that I'm keeping in mind how big my print will be at the end. So I'm going to be using watercolor, oil pastels, and wax pastels to create my monoprint. These are three materials that work really well because they transfer with water. I'm going to start with watercolor. And when I'm using watercolor to create a monoprint, I don't want to dilute it with as much water as I would if I were painting on paper because I want it to be able to stick to my plate surface and not bubble up. So I'm going to start adding to my plate, painting with my watercolor. And you'll see it is relatively translucent on here. And I'm just going to keep building up in layers of that paint until it reaches the opacity that I want it to have. I might also decide to leave some parts translucent. I might add another color to my print. And it will bubble up a little bit, but that's okay. That's kind of part of the look that you can achieve with a monoprint that you can't achieve with a straight watercolor painting. You get more of the texture and the gesture of your brush stroke. Once I've added what I want to add with watercolor, I'm going to move on and add some wax pastel. It's really important when you're using wax pastel in a monoprint that you're using a water-soluble wax pastel. These say water-soluble. You can't just use a crayon because it won't release with water, which is what we're going to be using to make our print. So I'm going to add some elements with that. And I don't need to work quickly because I actually want my watercolor to dry fully before I print it. So I can kind of take my time as I'm working. Maybe I want parts to overlap where I've added the watercolor. So that's something I can experiment with. And then I'm also going to add some oil pastel. Maybe I'll color in some parts. Maybe I'll add a mark going through. And you'll notice that colors are starting to layer here. That's something to consider when you're printing, similar to when you are painting. Once I have my image and I'm satisfied with it, then I'm going to wait for my watercolor to fully dry, and then I will print my artwork.